I saved his life that night, but in defying the hospital's unwritten rules, I unknowingly ripped open a wound that would bleed throughout St. Jude's. This wasn't just about a patient. It was about exposing the corruption festering beneath the sterile surface of the institution I served. The fluorescent lights of St. Jude's ER always hummed at a frequency that grated on my nerves, but that Tuesday night, the buzz felt like a swarm of angry hornets circling my head. I was already running on fumes, juggling 3 critical cases, and a resident who clearly thought triage was optional. My name is Dr. Alistair Finch. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon, which means I usually deal with the real emergencies, the ones that require a scalpel and a prayer, not the endless stream of chest-pounding complaints that filter down from the waiting room. It was almost 3 a.m. when the ambulance bay doors sleed open with that familiar pathetic wheeze. The paramedics wheeled in a gurney, moving with a professional urgency that immediately signaled trouble. On the stretcher was a man in his late 50s, breathing shallowly, his skin the color of old parchment under the harsh emergency lights. GCS dropping fast, the lead paramedic clipped out, shoving a chart at the triage nurse, Sarah. Massive MI, unresponsive to initial nitro. BP is 70/40 and falling. We're losing him. I looked up from stitching a teenager's frankly pathetic knife wound, a result of a dispute over a misplaced energy drink, and my attention snapped to the gurney. This wasn't just another heart attack. This was a ticking clock I couldn't afford to ignore. Get him to Bay 1 now. Get an IV in him, start the heparin drip. And page cath lab immediately, I barked, tossing the suture kit onto the stainless steel counter. I pulled off my blood-soaked gloves and made a beeline for the man. As I rounded the gurney, I saw the charge nurse, Brenda, already hovering, a grim set to her mouth. Brenda was competent, but she was also notoriously set in her ways. She looked at the patient, then at me, and hesitated. "Dr. Finch, she started, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that grated against the urgency of the situation. "What is it, Brenda? He's crashing. We don't have time for a status report," I snapped, my focus already locked on the monitor. His rhythm was erratic, a mess of ventricular ectopy that threatened to dissolve into fibrillation at any second. He's from the neighborhood, Doctor. Finch. You know the area he lives in, and he waited a while in triage." I stopped dead. The patient's chart showed he'd been waiting nearly an hour before his vital signs deteriorated enough for the paramedics to push him past the initial intake. I felt a familiar cold anger begin to simmer. St. Jude's was a teaching hospital, a supposed beacon of equitable care, but everyone knew which neighborhoods received priority treatment based on insurance forms and the subtle, unwritten codes of the old guard. "And," I challenged, locking eyes with Brenda, "is he stable enough for you to judge his socio-economic status? Because right now, he's coding. And if you think I'm going to let him die because of where his zip code dictates he should be treated, you're the one who needs to reread your Hippocratic oath." Brenda flinched, her face flushing crimson. "No, doctor, of course not. It's just, there was another patient, the governor's cousin, who came in complaining of mild indigestion 20 minutes after this gentleman arrived. The admitting physician felt what, Brenda? That indigestion trumps a massive inferior wall infarct." My voice was dangerously low, tight with suppressed fury. I didn't wait for an answer. I shoved the attending physician notes aside and quickly inserted the central line myself, my hands moving with practiced, brutal efficiency. "Give me 300 milligrams of lidocaine stat. Prepare for pacing." The man, whose name I saw now on the wristband was Mr. Elias Vance, was unresponsive. His skin was clammy, his pupils fixed and dilated. He was dying, perhaps because of the delay, perhaps because of the severity of the blockage. But the knowledge that protocol had clearly favored some petty local political figure over this man's life fueled every movement. I worked for the next hour in a desperate, silent battle, barking orders, overriding the junior staff when they hesitated, forcing the cath lab team into overdrive. We stabilized him, barely. He was admitted to the ICU under my care, a critical patient clinging to life. I spent the rest of the morning dealing with paperwork, making calls, and mentally preparing for the inevitable administrative headache this near miss would cause. I was tired, wired, and deeply resentful of the systemic failures I witnessed daily. 2 weeks later, the air at St. Jude's had changed. It wasn't the usual stale hospital atmosphere. There was a nervous tension, a buzz of suppressed excitement and fear. Whispers circulated like wildfire in the cafeteria and operating theaters. The Board of Trustees had made a shocking, unilateral decision. The Chief of Staff, Dr. Henderson, a man whose primary qualification seemed to be his decades of tenure and his penchant for golfing with the hospital's major donors, was out. Gone. Apparently, some unspecified irregularities in the budget had been uncovered during a sudden, unannounced audit. It was messy, fast, and terrifyingly sudden. And the replacement, that was the source of the electricity in the walls. I was scrubbing in for a bypass case, my mind already running through the anastomoses, when my scrub nurse hissed, "Dr. Finch, have you heard?" "Heard what?" "That I need to start this saphenous vein graft before the patient's heart turns to stone," I muttered, pulling my mask tight. "No, sir. The new Chief of Staff. He's starting Monday." "Well, let's hope he's better at managing supplies than Henderson was." "Who is it? Dr. Moreau?" "He's solid, if a bit rigid." The nurse hesitated, looking down at the sterile floor tiles as if they held the secret. "No, doctor, it's Mr. Vance's son." My hands froze, mid-motion, hovering over the sterile drapes. Elias Vance. The patient I fought tooth and nail to save. The patient who had been left languishing in the waiting room while the governor's cousin was ushered in for indigestion. "What?" I asked, the word barely a breath. I felt the blood drain from my face beneath the surgical mask. His son, Marcus Vance. He's an MBA, Harvard grade, worked in high-level hospital administration on the West Coast for 15 years. Apparently, the family wealth is substantial. And they decided to use it to clean up St. Jude's after what happened to Mr. Vance. The silence in the OR was suddenly deafening, broken only by the rhythmic beep of the monitors. I looked down at my hands, the hands that had fought for Mr. Vance's life, and then I remembered Brenda's hesitation, the implied threat of administrative reprisal for treating the wrong man. Marcus Vance. Now, he wasn't just some grieving son demanding answers. He was the most powerful man in the building, the one signing the paychecks, the one setting the priorities. He held the keys to the kingdom, and he was walking into the very halls where his father had nearly died due to negligence. I forced myself back to the task, my movements becoming jerky, imprecise. The bypass went fine, technically, but my internal world had completely fractured. Monday morning arrived, bringing with it a suffocating sense of dread. I walked into my office intent on reviewing my OR schedule, only to find a sticky note affixed to my monitor. It was stark white, professionally printed, bearing only a single directive. "Dr. Finch. Report to the Chief Administrator's office immediately. No appointments." My stomach dropped. They knew. They had to know. Had I been too vocal? Had Brenda reported my confrontation? Or was this simply the new regime cleaning house, starting with the loudest voice in the ER who dared challenge the status quo? I walked down the hallway, the polished marble floor reflecting my pale face in the expensive new lighting fixtures that certainly weren't there under Henderson's tenure. Indeed, the new chief administrator's office was on the executive floor, a floor I rarely visited, reserved for people who worried about capital investments, not cardiac output. I knocked once on the heavy mahogany door. "Enter," a voice commanded. It wasn't a nurse or an assistant. It was firm, deep, and entirely unfamiliar. I pushed the door open. The office was vast, minimalist, and dominated by a panoramic view of the city skyline, a skyline I realized I hadn't truly appreciated before. Behind a massive, uncluttered desk sat Marcus Vance. He wasn't wearing scrubs or a white coat. He was dressed in an immaculate dark suit that screamed money and authority. He didn't look up immediately. He was reading something on a tablet, his jaw set in a hard line. He made me wait there, standing in the doorway, for what felt like an eternity, the silence thick enough to choke on. Finally, he placed the tablet down, folded his hands on the desk, and looked up. His eyes were the same piercing dark brown as his father's, but they held a cold, calculating assessment that chilled me to the bone. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, recognition, or forgiveness. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please have a seat." I sat down, my spine rigid. "Mr. Vance, congratulations on the appointment. Don't," he cut me off, his gaze unwavering. "Save the pleasantries for the press releases, Doctor. We both know why I asked you here." He leaned forward, slowly, deliberately. I braced myself for the firing, the public humiliation, the accusation that I was too aggressive, too insubordinate. "When my father was brought into this hospital 2 weeks ago," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper that still managed to fill the room, "he was in full cardiac arrest, and yet he sat in your waiting room, overlooked, while another patient with gas pains was being rushed to imaging. My father survived barely because of the sheer, undeniable competence of a few individuals on that floor who refused to follow the subtle, unspoken rules of this institution." He paused, his eyes boring into mine. I opened my mouth to defend my actions, to explain that I was one of those individuals, but he spoke again before I could force the air out. "I have spent the last 2 weeks reviewing every single administrative decision made in this hospital over the last decade. I've read every internal memo regarding resource allocation, staff prioritization, and emergency room flow. And Doctor, I've read the deposition notes taken by my father's lawyers regarding the delay in his care." My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. He knew I was the primary physician who defied the hierarchy. He was going to thank me, and then subtly use me as leverage to dismantle the system, right? Marcus Vance stood up, walking around the desk until he was standing directly in front of me. He was taller than I expected. "And now," he said, his voice gaining a chilling inflection, "I have decided how St. Jude's will operate under my stewardship. I have zero tolerance for prejudice, inefficiency, or cowardice in leadership. Effective immediately, Doctor, I have reorganized the entire cardiac division structure." He leaned down, his breath faintly smelling of expensive coffee. You're no longer a specialist, Dr. Finch. You're now my right-hand man. I am making you the interim chief of staff for clinical operations. You will report directly to me. You have my full authority to enact whatever changes you deem necessary to ensure that no one, regardless of their perceived status, is ever neglected again." I stared up at him, completely speechless. Me? Interim chief of staff? I specialized in arteries and muscle, not budgeting and departmental politics. "But why me?" I finally managed to stammer out. "I'm a surgeon. I barely speak to administration." Marcus Vance smiled then, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was predatory, the smile of a hunter who had cornered exactly the right quarry. "Because you have the hands, Doctor. And you showed me you have the conviction. But more importantly," he stepped back, gesturing around the opulent office, "I need someone who remembers precisely what it feels like to be treated like dirt by the establishment. Welcome aboard, Doctor. You now have the power to make sure that the next time someone like my father walks through those doors, the person in charge is too terrified to look the other way." He walked back to his desk, picking up his tablet. "Now, Dr. Finch, your first directive is simple. I want a full audit of every admission from the West Side District over the last 3 years. And I want the name of the attending physician who signed off on prioritizing indigestion over a crushing EMI." He looked up, his expression hardening into stone. "And I want them fired by the end of the day." The air left my lungs in a silent rush. Me, interim chief of staff. The title felt alien, a heavy, ill-fitting suit draped over my operating attire. I was a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, yet Marcus Vance had just handed me the keys to the demolition crew. My first instinct was pure, unadulterated terror, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline so potent it drowned out weeks of fatigue. I had a mandate, and the target was clear: the entrenched corruption that had nearly cost Elias Vance his life. "Understood, Mr. Vance," I managed, my voice sounding steadier than I felt. "I'll start the audit immediately. We'll need access to the secure server logs and the archival physical charts for that period." Vance nodded once, dismissing the formalities. "The credentials have been uploaded to your new executive account. Use them. And Finch," he added, stopping me just as I reached the door. I want that attending physician's name on my desk before the cafeteria stops serving lunch. Make an example." I left the executive suite in a daze, the walk back to the surgery wing feeling less like a descent and more like ascending onto a battlefield. I was armed but entirely untrained for the political warfare ahead. My first stop wasn't IT, though. It was Bay 1, the sterile altar where I'd fought for Mr. Vance. It was empty now, just steel and lingering scent of disinfectant, but the memory of his labored breathing was vivid. I found Brenda, the charge nurse, charting furiously in the nursing station near the bay. She looked up, saw my face, the new, slightly stunned look of a man carrying the weight of the hospital on his shoulders, and her pen actually stopped moving. "Dr. Finch, you look different." "I am different, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice low, aware of the ears around us. "Marcus Vance is the new chief of staff. I'm interim chief of clinical operations." Brenda's jaw dropped, the color drained from her face, leaving her looking as ashen as Mr. Vance had looked on the gurney. "Oh, God, the Vances, they're coming for blood." "They are," I confirmed. "And I need to know who made the call on the admissions board that night, Brenda. Who was the attending physician who prioritized the governor's cousin over a patient crashing from a massive MI? She wrung her hands, glancing nervously towards the administrative wing. "Doctor, you can't ask me that directly if this gets back to—" "It won't," I interrupted, leaning in until we were nearly touching foreheads. "Because if you tell me now, discreetly—" You're on the side of reform. If you force me to pull records that you should have volunteered, I'll have to assume you were complicit in the cover-up. Which do you want to be remembered for, Brenda? Loyalty to a corrupt system, or loyalty to patient safety?" She swallowed hard, her eyes welling up. "It was Dr. Sterling," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Dr. Gregory Sterling. He's head of internal medicine admissions. He came down himself to reprioritize the board after the cousin arrived. Dr. Gregory Sterling. The name hit me like a physical blow. Sterling. He was the epitome of the old guard. Pompous, nepotistic, and notoriously hands-off unless a VIP was involved. He'd been at St. Jude's for 20 years, seemingly untouchable. "Thank you, Brenda. Now forget I asked. Focus on your patients." I straightened up, and the fear replaced by a cold, focused resolve. This wasn't about politics anymore. This was personal justice for Mr. Vance, and by extension, for every overlooked patient. I retreated to my office, locking the door and booting up the executive portal. Accessing HR files was surprisingly easy. Vance hadn't bothered with half measures. I found Sterling's file within minutes. Age 62. Board certifications immaculate. Salary high. Personal notes. A string of compliments about his stellar community relations and his dedication to hospital tradition. I pulled up the patient log for that Tuesday night. There it was. Elias Vance, arrival 2:51, triage status red, assigned bed 20 minutes later due to critical overcrowding. Then 3:15, governor's cousin, arrival, triage status orange, immediately assigned to Bay 1, the critical resuscitation bay, due to an order signed by G. Sterling, attending. The evidence was damning and irrefutable. Sterling hadn't just made a suggestion. He had physically intervened to usurp the official triage process. I drafted the termination notice immediately. It was clean, concise, citing gross misconduct and dereliction of duty leading to patient endangerment. I attached the log entries as primary evidence, then attached Brenda's coded notes about Sterling's physical presence at triage. I saved it to my desktop, ready to forward to Vance, a clean kill executed in under an hour. But as my finger hovered over the send button, a memory flashed. Sterling, years ago, blocking my application for the cardiac fellowship because I was too aggressive and lacking appropriate institutional respect. He hadn't just been protecting the status quo. He had been actively hindering my career growth because I didn't fit his mold. A flicker of doubt, a tiny sliver of self-preservation, urged me to send it straight to Vance. Let the new boss play executioner. But then I remembered the look on Marcus Vance's face when he spoke of his father. He hadn't asked me to delegate, he'd charged me to act. This was my trial by fire. If I passed this first test, I cemented my position. If I hesitated, I was just another cog Sterling could crush later. I took a deep, aim-steadying breath and hit send. The email zipped across the network to Marcus Vance, I sat back, waiting for the inevitable confirmation, perhaps a triumphant email from Vance. Instead, my phone began to vibrate violently, an internal call, not from Vance but from the Chief of Security. "Dr. Finch, you need to get down to the administrative wing immediately. Security sweep just flagged an unauthorized override on the HR termination protocol. Someone is trying to retract Dr. Sterling's access credentials just moments after you sent that file." My blood ran cold. Someone inside the network, someone with high-level clearance, was trying to save Sterling. It wasn't just the old guard fighting back. It was happening now. I jumped up, grabbing my phone and keys. As I bolted from my office, I realized the implications. Sterling had powerful friends who clearly monitored executive communications. I had exposed him, but I had also alerted his protectors. I burst into the elevator, slamming the down button repeatedly. Just as the digital display flashed 12, indicating I was approaching the main lobby, the elevator jolted violently, plunging the entire car into total darkness. The emergency lights flickered on weakly, bathing the small space in an ugly red glow. Then, a voice, not the security chief, not Vance, but a distorted, synthesized sound coming from the overhead speaker system, cut through the silence. "Interim Chief Finch, I advise you reconsider your audit targets. Dr. Sterling is crucial to the ongoing financial stability of this institution. His status is protected. If you proceed, you will find that the very foundation of your new position is built on sand. You have exactly 5 minutes to pull that termination order before we pull yours." The synthesized voice echoed in the tiny, red-lit cage of the stalled elevator, a chilling, disembodied threat. 5 minutes. The digital clock above the doors stubbornly remained frozen at 12. I felt the pressure mounting, not just from the threat, but from the sheer absurdity of the situation. I was trapped between floors, being blackmailed by an anonymous entity whose voice sounded like a cheap robotics demonstration. "Who is this?" I shouted into the intercom, my voice echoing flatly. "Identify yourself." The speaker crackled with static. Then the synthesized voice returned, sounding almost amused. "Identity is irrelevant, Doctor. What matters is leverage. You have power now, yes, but power is only as strong as its foundation, and foundations can be quickly eroded by scandal." Scandal. My mind raced. What scandal? I was a surgeon, not a politician. Then I remembered the last time I dealt with internal dirty laundry. The time I anonymously reported a resident for prescription fraud 2 years ago. I had been meticulous, convinced I had covered my tracks, but perhaps not well enough. "I'm revoking the order immediately," I lied, hoping to buy time to get the elevator moving. "Tell me where Sterling's supporters are coming from. Is it the board?" "Smart move, Finch. But too late to be convincing," the voice sneered. "The termination file is already flagged. We just need confirmation that you initiated it. Which is why we're taking this elevator offline. A sudden technical malfunction leading to a distressed physician on an unsecured line is a messy narrative. Imagine the headlines: New interim chief of staff fired after less than 3 hours for unfounded attack on senior staff." I frantically pulled out my mobile phone. No signal. Of course. The executive floor was apparently shielded, and now, so was this trapped elevator car. I was completely cut off. I slammed my palm against the emergency call button again, uselessly. 5 minutes. I had to move, or I was sunk. I scanned the small space. The access panel to the shaft was held by 2 small screws. "If you think firing me will save Sterling, you're mistaken," I grated out, already kicking off my leather dress shoes. "I'll take the fall. But Vance will just appoint someone else to clean up your mess. This isn't about Sterling. This is about covering up something much bigger." I grabbed the heavy metal clipboard I'd been carrying, the one with the patient notes from the bypass. It had a sharp corner. I jammed the corner repeatedly into the seam of the access panel above the door, prying with desperate strength. The metal groaned in protest. "You're making a mistake, Doctor," the voice warned, its tone shifting from smug control to genuine irritation. "This will end badly for you." With a final wrenching effort, the panel popped open, revealing a tight crawl space filled with dusty wiring and the sickening smell of ozone. I shoved the clipboard into the gap for leverage and scrambled up, hoisting myself into the blackness of the shaft, just as the synthesized voice hissed its final warning. "Time expired, Doctor. Say goodbye to St. Jude's." I heard the heavy clunk of the elevator locking down below me. I was suspended in the dark, clinging to the rough guide rail, my heart threatening to tear through my ribs. I was breathing hard, tasting grit and fear. I had to get to the floor above, the 13th administration, where Vance's office was, or the 11th, the main server room, where I could potentially clear my name and push Sterling's termination through. I started climbing the guide rail, hand over hand, relying on the sheer muscle memory from years of adrenaline-fueled emergency maneuvers. The silence from below was almost worse than the threats. They knew I was trying to escape. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 3 minutes, my fingertips brushed against the cool steel of the 13th floor landing door. It was an emergency override door, usually locked from the inside. I braced my feet against the shaft wall and pushed upwards with everything I had. The mechanism resisted, then gave way with a screech that sounded deafening in the quiet hospital night. I tumbled out onto the plush carpet of the executive hallway, landing in an awkward sprawl just outside Vance's outer office. The hallway was deserted. The muted, expensive lighting gave the space an eerie, funereal glow. I scrambled to my feet, checking my wrist. I'd somehow managed to keep my watch on. 1:15 a.m. I had maybe an hour before the morning shift started filling the halls. I had to reach Vance's office, get him awake, and show him the proof before the anonymous caller could spin the narrative. I rushed to Vance's inner office door. Locked. Of course. I pounded on it. "Mr. Vance, it's Finch. We have an emergency. Someone is trying to sabotage the Sterling termination." No response. I checked the outer office. Empty. Vance's assistant, who usually worked late, was nowhere in sight. I was about to smash the lock when my phone, which I'd shoved into my pocket, suddenly buzzed. A single, clear notification sound, finally catching a signal from the administrative floor's dedicated network. It was a message from my newly provisioned executive account. It wasn't from Vance, it was from the same synthesized sender. Subject: Revision to directives. Content: Dr. Finch. Your insubordination regarding the delay protocol was noted. Your immediate replacement is Dr. as Gregory Sterling, effective 1:30 a.m. Congratulations on securing your severance package. We trust you enjoy your ride down. Panic slammed into me like a physical object. Not only was Sterling still employed, but he had been promoted, taking my place, using my own compromised communication line to enact the demotion. They hadn't just tried to stop the firing, they had used the distraction to enact a coup. Just as the realization hit that I had been played, used as a convenient pawn to flush out the opposition. The emergency lights in the hallway abruptly went out, plunging the 13th floor into absolute, crushing darkness. Then, from inside Vance's office, the heavy door clicked, unlocking with a loud metallic thunk. It swung inward slowly, revealing not Marcus Vance, but Dr. Gregory Sterling, standing framed in the faint glow of the emergency exit sign down the hall. He was wearing fresh surgical scrubs, a confident, terrifying smirk plastered across his face, holding a silenced pistol aimed directly at my chest. "Welcome back to the bottom, Finch," Sterling whispered, his real voice smooth and venomous, finally audible. "You should have stayed in the OR." The sound of the lock disengaging was the final punctuation mark on my catastrophic failure. Sterling, standing in the doorway of Marcus Vance's sanctum, looked nothing like the meek bureaucrat I'd expected to be facing legal repercussions. He was composed, dangerous, and clearly in command of the situation. The weapon in his hand was not a prop. It was a promise of immediate finality. "Sterling," I breathed, my hands instinctively rising, not in surrender, but in a strange, detached recognition that this was how things ended when you tried to play a game you didn't understand. "You're the one running the override?" "I'm the one running everything, Doctor," Sterling corrected, taking a slow, deliberate step into the dimly lit hall. The exit sign painted a thin, red line across his chest. Marcus Vance was a loud, emotional annoyance, fixated on sentimentality over solvency. He underestimated how deeply entrenched we are. He thought throwing money at a problem meant he could buy integrity. Poor man. "You killed him," I stated, the realization dawning with sickening clarity. The synthesized voice wasn't some random hacker. It was a security protocol, likely initiated by Sterling himself, used to lure me away from the evidence and trap me into confirming my action, and thereby giving Sterling the justification he needed to seize Vance's interim power. The technical malfunction was a soundproofed murder scene, happening just behind that locked door. Killed is such a harsh word, Finch. Let's call it immediate administrative reassignment. Vance was never meant to last. He was a necessary distraction to flush out the Loyalists. You, however, were a necessary scapegoat. You made a perfectly timed error, challenging me, which allowed me to step in as the voice of stability after your supposed reckless power grab. The board loves stability, especially when it's backed by Sterling's community connections and deep coffers. The gravity of my situation crushed me. I hadn't just been fired. I was now standing in a hallway next to the executive suite where the new chief of staff had just been executed by the man I tried to fire. If I didn't escape, I would be the patsy, the unstable new chief of operations who panicked, attacked the legitimate head of the hospital, and was subsequently neutralized. My mind snapped back to the only thing I knew: survival under pressure. I was trapped between Sterling and the dead-end elevator shaft I'd just climbed out of. "You think you've won, Gregory," I challenged, injecting as much contempt as I could muster into my voice, trying to stall for a fraction of a second. "You just orchestrated a hostile takeover that relies on suppressing an investigation into patient neglect. Hey, you think the board won't look twice when Vance vanishes the moment you take over?" Sterling chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "The board is already looking at the financial stabilization plan I provided them an hour ago, Finch. They look very favorably upon my ability to manage crises discreetly. Now drop your clipboard and put your hands where I can see them." I shifted my weight, subtly angling my body away from the elevator shaft entrance. I still had the heavy metal clipboard from the triage bay, the only weapon I possessed. "You know, Gregory," I said, forcing a slow, casual exhale, "when I was in the OR, I was stitching a kid up who got stabbed over an energy drink. Pathetic, right? But you know what I remembered when I saw you step out of that office? I remembered Mr. Ain Vance's EKG rhythm when we first shocked him back to life." I took one step back toward the darkness of the shaft opening. Sterling tracked my movement, his finger tightening on the trigger. "That rhythm," I continued, my voice cracking slightly, making it sound like fear, not strategy. "It was erratic, chaotic, like an unstable arrhythmia." Before Sterling could process the non sequitur, I dropped the clipboard, not onto the floor, but directly into the open maw of the elevator shaft just beside me. The heavy steel sheet plummeted down the shaft with a deafening, metallic clang crash that echoed up the shaft, temporarily obliterating all other sound. Sterling flinched violently, his attention ripping away from me, focusing entirely on the massive noise echoing from below. It was the precise split-second distraction I needed. I didn't hesitate. I spun, launching myself backward directly into the pitch-black opening of the shaft entrance. I didn't try to climb down. I kicked hard off the wall, using the momentum to swing my body horizontally across the shaft opening, aiming for the opposite wall. Sterling roared in fury and fired. The suppressed shot was a dull thwump, the bullet tearing through the air where my head had been a millisecond before, embedding itself harmlessly into the plush carpet near the doorframe. I slammed against the far wall of the shaft, scraping my shoulder, but my momentum carried me across the opening. I grabbed the guide rail on the opposite side, the rail leading down to the server rooms on floor 11. "He's escaping down the shaft!" Sterling screamed into a radio I couldn't see, his voice already sounding strained with panic. "Hey!" I didn't wait for the response. I slid down the rail, ignoring the burning friction on my palms. Floor 12 was just a landing. Sterling had secured it. Floor 11, the server hub, that was the real prize. If I could get to the main network controls, I could override Sterling's takeover before he finalized the paperwork. I hit the 11th floor access door with a desperate kick, managing to dislodge the flimsy emergency lock. I tumbled into the humming, climate-controlled darkness of the server room, the air thick with the quiet thrum of 1,000 processes running simultaneously. I scrambled to the main terminal, my fingers flying across the keyboard, logging in with Vance's high-clearance credentials. The network security was sophisticated, but Sterling's hasty takeover meant the protocols were still vulnerable, and just built around his assumption of quiet administrative work, not open warfare. I bypassed the lockdown initiated by the synthesized voice. The system screamed warnings at me, but I ignored them. I found the HR termination log for Dr. Sterling, the one I'd sent to Vance, and I found the incoming notification: termination revoked, status, promoted to interim chief of staff. With shaking hands, I reversed the command, locking Sterling out of the administrative console. Then I found the access log from Marcus Vance's office. The door remained locked from the inside, but the internal environmental controls showed a precipitous drop in ambient temperature within the last 10 minutes, consistent with a system failure or perhaps a prolonged period of inactivity in a sealed room. I didn't wait to call the police. I didn't call Vance's private line. I didn't have time. I typed one final command, routing the entire verified evidence package, the original triage logs, Brenda's corroborating notes, and the recording of Sterling's synthesized threat followed by the sound of the gunshot, directly to the entire St. Jude's Board of Trustees email list, CCing the State Medical Board and 3 major local news outlets whose reporters I recognized from the ER press conferences. As the final confirmation flashed, upload complete, the heavy server room door behind me burst inward. Sterling stood there, his gun still raised, his composure completely shattered, his face a mask of absolute rage. "You little fool! You just burned the whole hospital down!" he screamed, leveling the weapon. I didn't move. I looked him dead in the eye, the rush of adrenaline now replaced by a strange, almost sublime, calm. "No, Gregory," I said, leaning back slightly against the cool metal server rack. "You did that when you let your ego make you kill a patient in the waiting room. I just made sure everyone saw the ashes." The sound that followed wasn't a gunshot. It was the high-pitched, insistent wail of police sirens ascending the access ramp to the hospital's main parking structure. Someone must have seen the lights flicker on the 13th floor. Sterling's eyes darted to the door, his expression flickering between murder and utter defeat. He knew he was cornered. As the first heavy thudding of armored boots echoed down the hallway outside the server room, Sterling made his final, desperate choice. He spun around, raised the gun to his own temple, and pulled the trigger. I stood there, covered in dust and sweat, as the cold logic of the server room chilling me to the bone. The hospital was in chaos. The board would be in emergency session by dawn. I was the man who just cleaned house with a scalpel and a data breach. I was still chief of staff, but now I had a real job, rebuilding St. Jude's from the wreckage I had just exposed. I looked down at my hands, the surgeon's hands, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.